This video is sponsored by Movie Palette.
So as you probably know, I hadn't seen any of the Scream movies up until relatively recently, while I watched them back to back for the first time, and I made a whole video about it, and then I was completely exhausted because making an hour-long video in 10 days will do that to you, that I didn't actually get around to making my review of Scream 6 until just now. Sorry for the delay, but I did actually see Scream 6 a few weeks ago. After the events in Woodsboro, survivor Sam Carpenter, played by Melissa Barrera, follows her half-sister Tara, played by Jenna Ortega, to New York, where Tara is attending college with surviving twins Chad and Mindy Meeks Martin, played by Mason Gooding and Jasmine Savoy Brown. But their past has followed them to the Big Apple, as a new ghost faces after Sam and Tara, and the Woodsboro Four must turn to Courtney Cox's Gale Weathers, Hayden Pattier's Kirby Reed, now an FBI agent, and Detective Wayne Bailey, played by Dermot Mulroney, to unmask the killer and stop them. So the production of the sixth movie is very similar to the second, in that the 2022 reboot was such a massive success that Paramount immediately greenlit a sequel. So here we are, just over a year after the release of the fifth film back in January 2022, we now have the sixth entry. And pretty much all the surviving cast from the last movie are back, with one major notable exception, but also we have the same creative team, including Radio Silence as directors, Matt Bettinelli-Olpin and Tyler Gillett. They return in their roles helming the franchise. And of course, if you saw my big video about the Scream series, you'll know that my major critique about the fifth movie is that if you're watching it after the fourth one, it does feel a little bit superfluous because their aims are similar, but you have to understand they needed to do that because a decade had actually passed between those two movies, and they needed to bring the franchise back to its roots. But of course, what I wanted to see from the franchise going forward is something new, and that's precisely what the sixth film offers by relocating to New York, which of course all big slasher movie villains have to conquer at some point. You think of Friday the 13th, Jason takes Manhattan, although Jason didn't actually take Manhattan until the last act of that movie. Nevertheless, it does get a little shout out here because that's actually playing on a television screen fairly early on into the movie. But nevertheless, this does show that Scream does have some new blood in it at last. Of course, that one major exception is Neve Campbell. That's right, Sidney is not back in this entry, which is a first for the franchise. Apparently, this was born out of a pay dispute, in that Campbell was offered by her accounts a fairly measly amount to reprise her role, so instead she just went, nah, and just stayed home. And honestly, silver linings, I think this ended up being for the best. Yes, I would like Campbell back in this franchise at some point. She is a major part of it, ideally with a paycheck she does actually deserve. But I do think that because they've had to take the character out, they've had to recalibrate the movie, and as a result, it's put a lot more attention on the new cast, which is exactly what the franchise needed, because a big problem with the last movie is that they were fairly bland. They were largely defined by their relationship to previous Scream characters, so now they actually get more of the spotlight. The absence of Sidney is not really something the movie misses, especially because she has been in 5 of these movies, and you get to a certain point of how many times can the same things happen to the same people? And the movie isn't backhanded about it either. They don't kill off a character off screen or anything childish like that. The characters do bring up Sidney a couple of times in the dialogue, as you would expect they would given the plot of the movie, most notably when Gale first shows up, and there's that very brief passing line, Sidney deserves a happy ending. And you know what? She does. The Scream franchise has had 25 years of Sidney being the focal point of the franchise. I think we can move on to something a little bit different, especially because we do still have legacy characters in the form of Gale and Kirby, but they're there to clearly support the new characters. This sixth entry also feels like it's less indebted to the 1996 film, which, given all the follow-ups up until this point have referred back to that, even outright replicating sequences from it, feels like a breath of fresh air in the Scream series. It feels like Radio Silence have taken the last movie to set all the pieces back in place place as we knew them and then turned them on their head. Basically going, you think you know a Scream movie? No, this is a Scream movie. It takes the familiar formula but adds a whole bunch of new twists, and you can see that intention right from the opening sequence. There are some links to Scream 2, most notably the college setting, something which the movie even points out for you, but the movie really isn't interested in that stuff. It's not trying to be a rehash sequel. Instead, if there was a sequel I was actually thinking of, it's Die Hard with a Vengeance, in that, like that movie, it takes the engine of their particular franchises, the familiar elements that you expect, and then transposes them onto a new location. The original Die Hard and the Scream franchise were both set in California. Now they're on the other side of the American coast. And also, that New York setting, both movies use them like their playground. It's busy, it's bustling, and it's dangerous. And again, going back to the opening sequence, the movie makes a lot of use out of dark, sinister alleys, the kind that litter all across New York, that every corner could be a place that Ghostface could jump out of. But also, this is a big open city, so the characters are at a disadvantage having to race around trying to stop Ghostface attacks. And when they do happen, they're now vertical. They're happening in skyscrapers, in apartment complexes. It's not like in California where you can dive out the first floor window or something like that. If Ghostface is in your apartment, you either have to try and work your way out of the front door, or as we see in another sequence, try and make your way over to the next apartment complex using a very rickety ladder and a very, very large drop below you. Certainly that's a sequence that owes a lot to the Emma Roberts movie Nerve, but nevertheless it is very well orchestrated. And again, because the apartments are so small, there is that genuine sense of panic in those sequences, particularly in that one where it's especially frenetic and hack and slash. New York life is stressful enough without a serial killer on your trail. You encounter weirdos all the time on the subway, and that's why that sequence is one of the standouts in the movie. It's a good use of the setting, and using that as a way of getting more potential suspense sequences out of it, because you don't know who the killer could be. Everyone's really tight and crammed together, and not to mention the film takes place over Halloween, so you've got loads of people in costume, including fellow ghost faces. You've also got Pinhead and Freddy as little shout-outs as well, and that is just really well done, and it hits upon a primal fear that we all have of just sitting next to people on public transport. It gets into those kind of fears of city living in its suspense sequences. Ghostface is also far more vicious in this outing, to the point of being unrelenting in a way that we haven't really seen in any of the previous Scream movies. I think about the sequence where he follows the two into the shop and he pretty much kills all the other customers and the storekeeper, and then grabs a shotgun and starts blasting away inside while the two try to evade him round the aisles. Again, a well orchestrated, genuinely tense sequence, but certainly we've never seen a Ghostface as public and as brutal as this one is. It again speaks to a different kind of psychology, which is given away at the beginning of the movie when Ghostface hisses, "Who gives an F about movies?" Roger Jackson seems to be especially enjoying getting some particularly cutting remarks over the phone in the way that he hasn't been given in quite a long time. It just speaks to the fact that the intensity of the Scream series is now being pumped up to match what audiences expect from horror movies nowadays. Of course, there's also the fact that this is a Ghostface that reveres the previous ones, that has collected all the trophies and memorabilia of the past. Again, this Scream movie, while it is new, it does have a lot of links to the past, and certainly the scene where they uncover Ghostface's lair has loads and loads of Easter eggs for fans of the franchises. You kind of go around going, oh, that's that thing from that, and that thing from that, and yeah, it's kind of fun, and I imagine that once you get a chance to freeze frame it all, I'm sure there'll be plenty of people to kind of point out where everything comes from. Probably the best Ghostface attack sequence in the film, though, is the extended set piece in Gale's apartment. apartment. Gale is written quite well in the film. She's largely there to deliver exposition, which of course makes sense being that she's a reporter, but she's very much written in character. And this sequence when it arrives is the character's big moment in the spotlight in this movie. It begins with Ghostface calling her up and pointing out they haven't actually had a one-on-one confrontation over the phone in any of the previous movies, which seems like a strange oversight, and also does have a bit of a logic hole in that how would this Ghostface even remotely know about that? But nevertheless, it points out that this is a long-awaited confrontation, and I think that this delivers. This sequence brings all the reversals, suspense, and humour that you would expect out of a Scream set piece. And it helps that Courtney Cox, she's so used to playing Gale, and Gale is so battle-hardened that she's determined not to go out without a fight. This sequence also has a lot of jeopardy about it because you genuinely don't know if the filmmakers are going to actually kill off Gale in this entry. I certainly found myself wondering, are they actually going to do it? Are they going to follow the course of Dewey in the last movie? Again, having killed off a main character in the previous entry, it means that almost anyone could be up on the chopping block. The violence is also ratcheted up even more than the previous entry, which I do have to admit I started having issues with. I did wonder if the film was doing this deliberately, because in the opening sequence it very purposefully lingers on the victim's suffering as she dies, and the killer afterwards talks about how he enjoyed that, how she was like an animal dying, and so in that case it felt like the movie was critiquing it. But then the rest of the carnage is presented fairly straightforwardly and with a lot of gore, so I don't think there was any particular commentary on that stuff. And I also think it was kind of treading close into sadistic territory, where it was starting to become a little bit uncomfortable for me because that was overwhelming some of the dark humour. That's admittedly personal preference, but I think that's also because I found the violence to be strangely overcompensatory, like it was so OTT, because aside from killing off a lot of secondary characters and extras, it was reluctant to actually do anything with the main cast. Like, a lot of the time, they find themselves in predicaments where they end up getting stabbed, but largely seem to shrug that off, which is a bit of a problem in a slasher movie where the main subject of peril is getting stabbed to death. That kind of takes away a lot of the suspense. It gets very silly. It was starting to annoy me how often characters were suffering really grievous wounds and just keep running around. Like, come on, seriously. It just felt a little bit too much. Ironically, and somewhat unusually for a slasher film, I actually think this is borne out of the fact the movie perhaps likes its characters maybe a little bit too much, but I can understand why, because they bring a necessary emotional core to the movie that brings some much needed levity, but also some stakes, because you genuinely care about them. The movie continues Sam's storyline from the previous film, where of course she learnt she was descended from the original film's killer, Billy Loomis, and she's still dealing with the mental health challenges of that. There's still a side of her that wants to kill, but she's trying to resist it, not aided by the fact that there is someone harassing her online, claiming to be a truther about Woodsboro, that she was in fact the killer, which of course is a lie. And the film keeps seeding this idea that after a certain level of trauma, someone could just snap. They could become a killer. And that is the idea that potentially Sam could go down. There is this idea that because she's family, because that's where she's descended from, that is the path that she could follow. But the movie refutes that with this dynamic, in that the survivors of the Woodsboro tragedy, they now consider themselves to be like a family. They're the Woodsboro Four, as they dub themselves, and they're looking out for each other. I think Sam's storyline is better handled in Scream 6 because Melissa Barrera is noticeably improved on the previous outing. She's much more confident and assured in the role, and thus the plotline feels more convincing. convincing, but the star power is still pretty clearly with Jenna Ortega as a half-sister Tara, and it's pretty noticeable in the suspense sequences because notice how many times it cuts to Ortega for a close-up instead of Barrera, who is meant to be the main character. Nevertheless, the dynamic between Barrera and Ortega feels really natural. They have a good chemistry with each other, and I like the dynamic between the two characters where Sam is very protective of Tara, but Tara wants to be independent. She wants to make her own choices and her own mistakes, which is actually kind of remarkable given what happened to her at the beginning of the previous movie. But nevertheless, Ortega clearly has the it factor, and you can see that even in this movie, and she's given a much more expanded role. Once the characters realise that something is actually going on, they all very quickly band together and support each other, and I think that that is one of the reasons why these new Scream movies work for a new audience, and why they work for the Gen Z crowd that these new films are aimed at, because they relate to these characters that actually support each other and work together. It's actually all about family. Vin Diesel would be proud. To that end, once again I enjoyed Jasmine Savoy Brown's performance as Mindy, who's of course related to Randy and fills his role in the series, proudly announcing in this entry, "We're officially a franchise." And that scene where she describes the rules of ongoing sagas is absolutely hysterical, especially the shot at Letterboxd included in it. It's very, very funny and very, very Scream. I also love the moment where Mindy actually sits down briefly with Kirby. They're both horror fans and they're both talking about what they love. It's a really nice interaction. It's a good crowd-pleasing moment, and Hayden Panettiere makes a fantastic return to the series. When Panettiere is on screen, you remember why fans were so desperate to bring the character back. She really nails the series' tone and wit in her performance. Panettiere is one of the major highlights of Scream 6, and the way that they've evolved her character, where she's now an FBI agent kind of specialising in the Ghostface killings, sort of makes sense. And I feel like the return of Kirby as a character makes up for the absence of Sidney, in that we have a link to the past, but also she's a newer character than a lot of Scream's staples, so she still feels quite fresh. And so in that way, I think that Panettiere would be a good character to keep around for the foreseeable future. I also think the movie has a very strong supporting cast, and I do like that Radio Silence drops in a couple of nods to their Ready or Not co-stars in the form of Henry Kernzi and Samara Weaving, both of whom have relatively small roles in the first act of this movie. Unfortunately, it's let down by a weak third act, especially once it reveals who the killer is. The film's trying to be clever, it's trying to homage Scream's past, but it's disappointing for similar reasons. And I also think the stakes for who the identity of the Ghostface is heightened by what the film does in the pre-title sequence, where you go, oh, well, if they do something like that, then the reveal at the end of it must be an absolute killer. And it turns out, no, not really. It feels strangely forced, and I think the biggest disappointment with it is the movie sets up this idea that this is a Ghostface fan, that this is an obsessive, and the reveal kind of flies in the face of that. It just kind of pushes that idea to the side, and I think that's why it doesn't really work. It isn't something where you feel like it's actually satisfying, and then it goes into a very extended climax and battle, and it just feels like it's too much. It just ends up kind of being weirdly numbing. I felt like it was getting a bit too excessive at that point. I go back to that point about the violence being a bit too over the top and a bit too exaggerated. You really start to feel it in this last section of the movie, where it feels like the filmmakers were trying really hard to top themselves from the last outing, but instead it just feels like it's trying way too hard. That's unfortunate. For the most part though, I enjoyed Scream 6, not least of which because it finally felt like something different, galvanised by a new location bringing offering new set pieces and new twists, while still feeling familiarly like Scream, and still having that subversive, self-aware humour that we expect out of the franchise. It also packs plenty of genuinely edge-of-your-seat, suspenseful sequences all throughout, which are really well orchestrated by radio silence. It's just a shame the movie fumbles in the home stretch, but nevertheless, it proves that the Scream franchise does actually have a future, that it's not simply content to recycle the past over and over again. And certainly, I would like this series to continue, especially if it can continue to offer us a slice of something new.
Hello, Sydney. What's your favorite scary movie?
Because you can now get it from Movie Palette. Imagine your favourite films as a piece of art. In this case, this is Terminator 2 Judgment Day. But of course, you can pick any of your favourite scary movies to put on your wall, including the entire Scream franchise. So go to moviepalette.com and use the code FilmBrain15 to get 15% off your order. Now, my favourite scary movie is Cats. If you like this review and you want to support my work, you can give me a tip at my Ko-fi page, or with YouTube's Super Thanks feature, which is right below the video, or you can buy some of my merch from my TeePublic page, or you can take a stab at my Patreon, where you can see my videos early, among other perks, including access to my Discord server. But until next time, I'm Matthew Buck, fading out.